Welcome to ancient Egypt. Today we're going to be talking about how Egypt went from farming to government. First, we need to take a look at economics, one of our major concepts in ancient history. How did Egyptians farm? Well, farmers planted wheat, barley, and flax seeds during wet seasons. In the dry seasons, farmers irrigated their crops. They dug basins or bowl shaped holes to store river water. Canals then went from those basins to fields, letting water flow to the crops. Egyptian farmers developed tools to make work easier. Farmers created a shadoof, which is a bucket attached to a long pole that lifts water from the Nile and empties it into basins. It's actually still used today. Egyptian farmers also needed a way to measure the area of their lands. When floods washed away boundaries, farmers actually used geometry to help them recalculate where their field was and where the other farmer's field was. Because they were protected from outside attacks by deserts, farmers could grow surplus food. Extra food meant that people could become artisans, merchants, and traders. As more goods became available, villages by the Nile traded. Along with the exchange of goods, Egyptian traders learned about new ways of life and governments. Of course, with that, we get politics. Government became super important as farming and trade increased. A government was necessary to oversee making and fixing irrigation canals, storing and giving out food, and settling land ownership disputes. Over time, villages merged to form small kingdoms ruled by a pharaoh. Weaker kingdoms fell to stronger ones, and by 4000 BCE, Egypt had two large kingdoms: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north by Egypt's delta. Narmer was the king of Upper Egypt. In 3100 BCE, he conquered Lower Egypt and married a Lower Egypt princess, unifying the kingdoms for the first time. Narmer made a new capital at Memphis, a city on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. He ruled both parts of Egypt from the city. Memphis began to flourish as a center of government and culture along the Nile. Over here, you can see Narmer with his giant hat on this amazing plaque. And if we click again, you can see me being very excited to see this plaque when I was in London. It is in the British Museum. I did get that close and I was that excited. Narmer's kingdom lasted long after his death. The right to rule went from father to son to grandson. A line of rulers from one family is called a dynasty. And when a dynasty dies out because there's no more sons or kids, another one takes over. From 3100 to 332 BCE, almost 3,000 years, 30 different dynasties ruled. These are organized into three time periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Throughout these periods, Egypt was united under a single ruler and had stable government. Let's dive into some social structure. Not only did we go from trade to getting a government, but now we have to organize that government. So, a pharaoh ruled ancient Egypt's government. The pharaoh was usually, but not always, male. He was considered a god, specifically the falcon headed Horus, who was king of the living. No one was allowed to speak to or look at the pharaoh without permission. Egyptians treated the pharaoh like a god even after his death. They believed he became the god Osiris after he died. His body was mummified and buried with everything he may need for his journey into the afterlife. Viziers. Pharaohs could not run the government alone. One or two viziers were second to the pharaoh. They oversaw the pharaoh's affairs. They oversaw the justice and the legal system, building projects, regional governors, tax collection, and the treasury. All other officials gave daily reports to the vizier. Down here at the bottom, you see Imhotep. He was the very first vizier, and he was named Imhotep, and he's famous for designing the first pyramid. He was like, Pharaoh, I got you. I know how to make you super memorable. We're going to put you inside a giant triangle. And later, it was discovered that they believed Imhotep was actually a god who had come down to help. And so he was made into a god. Governors under viziers were called nomarchs. Now, a nomarch ruled over a nome, which is basically like a state or a province. So we have states like California, they had nomes. Nomarchs were chosen by the pharaoh, or they received their position from their father. The army commander, the chief treasurer, and the minister of public works also reported to the pharaoh. Each official had different responsibilities and powers, but the pharaoh had the final say. Many of the officials were priests and scribes who kept track of finances, recorded taxes, and made sure people were doing their job. Yo, farmer, did you do your job? Yeah. So we see over here in this picture, all the little nomarchs, they're all kind of kneeling down. Then we've got these dudes, the vizier, and they are all reporting to the pharaoh. Ancient Egypt's legal system was based on common sense. There was a lower and high court, and the lower court, underneath all of those officials, consisted of a group of elders in each town. The pharaoh, way at the top, was the supreme high court judge, but he usually had his vizier hear cases and act as judge. People represented themselves because there were no lawyers. Serious crimes like murder usually resulted in death. Thieves were often punished with the amputation or cutting off of limbs. Lose a hand. Men and women, along with people from all social classes except those who were enslaved, were essentially equal under the law. Men and women both had the right to own and sell property, make contracts, marry, get divorced, and receive inheritance. And this is a really good place to end because this is a big difference from Mesopotamia. Remember in Hammurabi's code, women were not equal to men. And so in Egypt, we are headed into a time where women are doing just as many things as men. That's all for today, as we kind of touched on economics and how that affected politics and how that affected our social structure and our laws.